Hello everyone, welcome to this third talk about eschatology. I became a Christian around the time of my 20th birthday. And in those early days, as I read through the Gospels, it wasn't long before I came to a chapter where Jesus says some very scary things. In fact, a very similar chapter appears in Matthew 24, Mark 13 and Luke 21. And these chapters are often referred to as the signs of the times. Now, although scary to me as a young Christian, they were also very exciting. End of the world stuff. It seemed to me that Jesus was giving the church some inside information about the end of the world and things to watch out for, that somehow would give us safe passage through some terrible times ahead. And this indeed is how many people still understand these chapters, but not everyone. There are many Christian thinkers who believe that the things Jesus says here have a much more immediate application in the first century. In a moment, we're going to read through from one of these chapters, and we're going to look at Matthew 24. But it's worth noting first that the New International Version puts a heading to this section, and it says, "The destruction of the temple and signs of the end times." In other words, the experts who compiled the New International Version see Jesus' words here as applying to two different scenarios. First, the judgment which fell on the Jerusalem temple in AD 70, and second, the events that will happen towards the end of this age, before Jesus returns in his second coming. But this leads to a puzzle. What applies to which? Or which applies to what? Does everything Jesus say have an end of the world application? Or does some of it only apply to the fall of Jerusalem? Christians have come to believe different things. Like many, I used to think that these verses were all about the end of the age. But I now see that a good case can be made that these verses are primarily directed towards the situation that faced Jesus' first followers in the first century. So, let's explore this together, and perhaps we will begin to wonder if the NIV is right or wrong about the heading to Matthew 24. So, Matthew 24, beginning at the first verse. Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. "Do you see all these things?" he asked. "Truly I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down." As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. "Tell us," they said, "when will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Jesus answered, "Watch out that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, claiming, 'I am the Messiah,' and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumours of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of birth pains. Then you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death, and you will be hated by all nations because of me. At that time, many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other. And many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold. But the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetop go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back and get their cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath. For then there will be great distress, unequalled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equalled again. If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. At that time, if anyone says to you, "Look, here is the Messiah," or "There he is," do not believe it. For false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect. See, I have told you ahead of time. So if anyone tells you, "There he is out in the wilderness," do not go out, or "Here he is in the inner rooms," do not believe it. For as lightning that comes from the east is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever there is a carcass, there the vultures will gather. Immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from the sky and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And then all the peoples of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. Now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as you see its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that the summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. Let's begin by noticing that in verse 3 the disciples ask two separate questions. First, when will all this happen? In other words, when will the temple of Jerusalem be thrown down? And they ask a second question, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Now the disciples may well have thought that the answer to both questions would be the same. It's quite likely that the disciples thought that the fall of the temple would signal the end of the age and the return of Jesus. Now, of course, we know this wasn't the case, and the disciples were really asking two questions with two separate answers. However, in responding to the disciples' questions, Jesus typically replies in a prophetic fashion by weaving words together that take a lot of unpicking. It's easy to see why Christian bookshelves are full of authors who claim insight on end-of-the-world interpretations of this chapter. The internet too will offer the inquisitive a rich diet in fantastic future fulfillments of these verses. Only recently, a Christian writer called John Hagee wrote a book entitled 4 Blood Moons, Something is About to Change, in which he claims that every time what he calls a tetrad of red-coloured moons appears in the sky, then something really important happens on the earth. Greg Boyd decided to investigate Hagee's claims, and after a lot of research reached the conclusion that Hagee is misguided, to say the least. And you can listen to what Greg says about that on the YouTube link that Matt provided, or you can just search for Greg Boyd, The End of the World as You Know It. It's a talk that's well worth a listen. So yes, many Christians see these verses as applying to the end of the age. And this leads to a lot of effort being expended in searching for clues as to when Jesus will return. But is this right? Let's notice something that Jesus is recorded as saying in all three Gospel accounts. So in Matthew 24, verse 34, Jesus says, "Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened." And the same words exactly appear in Mark 13 and in Luke 21. So with word-for-word consistency, Matthew, Mark and Luke all record Jesus as saying that everything that he's just listed out as about to happen would happen within the lifetimes of some of those who were standing listening to him. This means that those who think that Jesus is really speaking about the future, things that were going to happen at the end of this age, must choose from one of the following options. Some have said that Jesus really did think that he would return in his second coming within the lifetimes of his first followers. And this, they say, is all down to the fact that his knowledge was limited because he took on a human nature. Really, this seems unlikely. Others simply just choose to ignore this verse completely. And others think that these chapters are full of double meanings, where some things could have a first century fulfillment, whilst other things are totally about the end times. What we can know without a doubt is the real reason that the disciples first asked their questions. And they weren't particularly interested, I don't think, in what might happen hundreds or thousands of years in the future. What they wanted to know was, if Jerusalem was about to fall, what should they do? Should they rally to Jerusalem's defence and man the battlements? Or should they flee? And if so, when? Surely Jesus was giving them some kind of answer here, and not just answering in a way that didn't really apply to them, but only to the future. So, is it really possible that the majority of these verses did apply directly to the first century and the fall of Jerusalem to the Romans in the year AD 70? Let's go through the things that Jesus predicts in this chapter. First of all, he mentions false messiahs, false prophets. And according to the Jewish historian Josephus, there were many such people in the years between AD 33 and AD 70. Many of them led unsuccessful uprisings against Rome, and this led to a constant climate of fear. And this could well be the wars and rumours of wars, as Rome constantly threatened to invade, and indeed sometimes did send in its legions to brutally put out all threats of an insurrection. Then Jesus predicts persecution. And of course we know that the first century church was persecuted by both the Jewish establishment and by the powers of Rome. In the parallel passage in Mark 13, Jesus predicts that it will be the Jewish authorities that will instigate much of this persecution. In verse 9, Jesus says, "You must be on your guard. You will be handed over to the local councils and flogged in the synagogues. On account of me, you will stand before governors and kings as witnesses to them." And it goes without saying that this persecution within Jewish synagogues is very unlikely to have an end of the world fulfillment. Next, Jesus predicts earthquakes and famines. And the history books record at least 5 earthquakes in that period in the local area. So there was an earthquake in Crete in the year 46 AD, an earthquake in Rome in the year 51, an earthquake in Apamea in the year 53, and again Laodicea in the year 60, and Campania in the year 62. What about famines? Well, we know from Acts chapter 11 that a great famine came on the area, and this happened between the years 41 to 54 AD during the reign of Claudius Caesar. And then in the year 65 AD, a plague, possibly linked to malnutrition, killed 30,000 people in Rome itself. Next, Jesus predicts betrayal by family and false brothers. And again, there are historical records, for example, from during the reign of Nero, that Christians were handed over to the authorities by parents, by children, and by brothers and sisters. This shocking divide between believers and non-believers within the same family echoes Jesus' own words. Matthew 10, Jesus says, "Do not suppose that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to turn a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies will be the members of his own household." Next, Jesus says that the gospel would be preached to the whole world. And at first sight, to our way of thinking, this could not have been accomplished within the lifetimes of the first disciples. But we have to remember that the whole world, to the Jewish mindset of the first century, simply meant both within Israel and beyond Israel. To the first century Jew, the borders of the Roman Empire formed all of the known world. It didn't mean what it does to us today. When we say the whole world, we think of every single people group and in every geographical locality around the globe. And of course we know that the gospel certainly did spread far and wide throughout the whole of the Roman Empire in the first century, the whole world. Next, Jesus mentions the abomination that causes desolation. And this is a reference to the book of Daniel. So first of all, in Daniel 9, we read, "And at the temple he will set up an abomination that causes desolation, until the end that is decreed is poured out on him." These apocalyptic chapters in Daniel were read avidly by Jews of the first century because they speak of triumph over pagan invaders. And of course the Jews searched them for prophetic clues as to how God would step in and deliver his people from the Romans. In his vision, Daniel foresees the occasion when the Greek king of Syria, Antiochus Epiphanes, places an image of Zeus on the altar in the Jerusalem temple. And this happened in the year 167 BC. Jesus refers to it here partly because of its strange reference to a son of man who will be a deliverer, and also because it can be seen as having a second fulfillment when Jerusalem falls to the Romans. Jesus may have in mind the boots of Roman soldiers trampling the most holy place and planting the standards of the Roman legions within the temple with their depiction of an eagle. Interestingly, in ancient times, both eagles and vultures weren't necessarily seen as different classes of bird, which is possibly why Jesus says, "Wherever there is a carcass, there the vultures will gather." So, of course, this reference to a desecration of the temple most certainly happened within the lifetimes of Jesus' first listeners. Jesus then refers to the coming of the Son of Man in Matthew 24, verse 27. which was another reference to Daniel chapter 7. So there we read, "In my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed." Tom Wright makes the point that this coming in Daniel 7 is an upward movement and not a downward movement. In other words, the Son of Man is arriving with the clouds into the courts of heaven. So Tom Wright is one of many who believe that rather than a reference to his second coming to earth, Jesus may have in mind here his ascension, going into heaven, which along with his resurrection would be the sign that vindicates the truth of his words. All that he has said is true. He rose from the dead, just as he said he would, and he ascended into the clouds, witnessed by his followers, to be seated again on his heavenly throne, just as he said he would. And of course, the Jerusalem temple was thrown down, just as he said it would be. Tom Wright explains when he comments on this parallel passage in Luke 21. The best way of understanding this passage in Luke is to see it as the promise that when the Jerusalem that had opposed his message is finally overthrown, this will be the vindication of Jesus and his people, the sign that he has indeed been enthroned at his Father's side in heaven. Luke does, of course, believe in the second coming of Jesus. We know that from Acts 1:11. But this passage is not about that. It is about the vindication of Jesus and the rescue of his people from the system that has oppressed them. So far, we've seen that the things that Jesus has said can quite possibly have a first century fulfillment. But then what about this bit? What about the sun and moon being darkened, the heavens shaken, stars falling from the sky? At first sight, this does seem like end-of-the-world stuff, not events that could have taken place in the first century. At this point, we have to ask, what would Christians of the first century have thought? Because it turns out that this was very common, well-known metaphorical language. This is how first century Jews spoke, whenever they spoke of social and political turmoil and upheaval. When their world was being turned upside down, which normally meant violence, these are the words they used to describe it. The heavens were shaking. The sky was being dissolved. They thought that events on the earth were mirrored from events in the unseen spiritual realm. It was idiomatic, as they say, and idioms are very hard for us to get our heads around. Greg Boyd illustrates this by our modern-day idiom when we say, "It's raining cats and dogs." It's just a saying. I don't know where it comes from or why we say it. But imagine in 2,000 years' time, if they uncover something written today where we predict that the day would come when it rained cats and dogs for 40 days, they would be quite wrong to think that we literally meant that cats and dogs would fall from the sky. It's just an idiom, a way of speaking. So when Jews of the first century spoke of the heavens being shaken, it was a picture of an unseen cosmic upheaval that mirrored upheaval on the earth. It wasn't meant literally. Similarly, if first century astronomers or astrologers observed something like a comet in the sky, They would take it as a portent, a sign that something was about to happen. They believed that upheavals in the rising and falling of nations and empires were mirrored by events in unseen spiritual realms and revealed in cosmic signs. There are examples of this way of thinking and speaking elsewhere in Scripture. For example, the vivid language that describes the judgment on the nation of Edom, and this comes in the prophet Isaiah. So Isaiah says in chapter 34, "All the stars in the sky will be dissolved, and the heavens rolled up like a scroll. All the starry host will fall like withered leaves from the vine, like shriveled figs from the fig tree. My sword has drunk its fill in the heavens. See, it descends in judgment on Edom, the people I have totally destroyed." This judgment of God fell on Edom in the 6th century BC, when it was conquered by the Babylonians. And most definitely, the stars did not dissolve or fall from the sky. It was just an idiom, a saying of the time. Similarly, in Acts chapter 2, Peter quotes from Joel chapter 2, saying that the pouring out of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost fulfills Joel's prophecy. So we read in Acts, "Then Peter stood up with the 11, raised his voice and addressed the crowd. 'Fellow Jews, and all of you who live in Jerusalem, let me explain this to you. Listen carefully to what I say. These people are not drunk, as you suppose. It's only 9 a.m. No, this is what was spoken by the prophet Joel. In the last days, God says, I will pour out my spirit on you, all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your young men will see visions. Your old men will dream dreams. Even on my servants, both men and women, I will pour out my spirit in those days, and they will prophesy. I will show wonders in the heavens above and signs on the earth below, blood and fire and billows of smoke. The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the great and glorious day of the Lord. And everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved.'" Peter seems to be saying, now, today, these things are fulfilled. These are the last days prophesied by Joel. God's Spirit has been poured out on the people. The sun is darkened, the moon is turned to blood, the heavens are shaken, and the great day of the Lord is upon us. In other words, the world is changing, and it will never be the same again. God's kingdom is breaking in, and the old order of things is being shaken up forever. Peter didn't literally mean that the stars were falling from the sky or the moon had turned red. It was just their idiomatic way of saying, our world is being turned upside down. Next, Jesus says that his angels or messengers, that's what angels means, messenger, his messengers will gather the elect from the four winds, which of course supporters of the secret rapture claim refer to Christians being evacuated from the earth. But in its first century context, this can more likely mean that the angels, messengers, are in fact Christians, Christ's witnesses, and Christians will spread the good news of the gospel throughout the known world, and so gather in the harvest of God's people from all the nations. So what we are seeing is that virtually everything here that Jesus says is in one sense fulfilled within the lifetime of some of those present listening to him in the first century. The temple would fall, and Christians would be scattered and evangelize the whole of the known world. But Jesus has chosen his words most carefully, as is always the case. He knew that his disciples were also asking a second question. When would he return at the end of the age? And Jesus goes on to say this: "But about that day or hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. This is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man." What are we to make of this? After giving this long list of signs of the times and saying that all of these things will happen to that generation living in the first century, Jesus says that not even he knows when he will return in his second coming. Only the Father knows. If Jesus did not know when his second coming would be, how can he be giving a checklist in this chapter so that we will know when he is coming back? All this is in agreement with what Jesus says elsewhere. We need to be ready because we will not know when he will return. At the end of the parable of the wise and foolish virgins, Jesus simply says, "Therefore, keep watch, because you do not know the day or the hour." Keep watch. In other words, be diligent and faithful, because you don't know the time. And that's quite different to keep watch, watch the skies for signs, monitor the frequency of earthquakes and famines, and look out for blood moons. What can we say in conclusion? Despite the cosmic type of language that Jesus uses in these chapters of Matthew, Mark and Luke, these chapters can be faithfully interpreted as applying to the first century context. And Jesus' words concerning his second coming may well be limited to his concluding remarks about that time being unknown even to him. Some have claimed that Matthew 24 provides a tick list of events, a catalogue of end-time signs that we all need to be watching out for. Yet the clear message of Jesus here is that when he returns, life would be going on as normal, eating, drinking, and marrying. So for Christians to be studying the stars and looking for blood moons seems to be missing the point entirely. I don't think that Jesus is going to reward those who've spent their time gazing through telescopes or cataloguing earthquakes and tsunamis. Surely this is not what Jesus meant by seeking first the kingdom of God. Surely Jesus means us to follow in his footsteps by being his witnesses, sharing the good news, loving others. And I'm sure that that is what he will reward. And I think that is what he meant by being ready. So as we finish today, let's wonder, let's ask the question, is the New International Version right to entitle this section of Matthew 24, The Destruction of the Temple and Signs of the End Times? What do you think? Thanks for listening.